What's in a name? An important question. Calling a rose by anything else sure plays merry hell with search engines, so maybe labels are more important now than they were for the great bard. This brings me to today's topic. Why are strategy genres such a mess? Hi, I'm Calivan, and I think a discussion about how we refer to this particular group of games is long overdue. When you're dealing with vast quantities of media, tags, labels and categories are absolutely essential. This isn't some sort of modern realisation that came about after the rise of streaming and digital media. Libraries, record shops and bookstores have been relying on it since their inception. If you didn't have the category system on Netflix, all you would have is pages and pages of random terrible movies. Okay, that's a bad example. Netflix is still pretty much that. But it would be a pretty frustrating experience to go into a bookstore and everything was just in one massive pile in the middle of the floor. That said, genres or categories can't be too narrowly focused in physical stores. You don't have the space for enough media to warrant them, but since most of us buy digital these days, I think we could afford to be a bit more liberal with their usage. Digital also brings other benefits, as you can easily give a single game, film or song multiple labels in the case there's a lot of overlap. This means that you don't have to worry about the endless levels of subcategories for media that spans many genres. Is Justified a drama, a neo-western or a cop show? It's brilliant, but I'm glad we don't have to make a whole new neo-western police drama subgenre just for it to sit alone in. So what's the problem with how we describe strategy and tactics games? It's hard to know where to start. Stellaris is a strategy game where battles happen in real time. StarCraft is a strategy game where battles happen in real time. Warno is a strategy game where battles happen in real time. So is Total War. If a die-hard StarCraft fan went looking for another real-time strategy game and found Total War, they might like it because it's excellent, but chances are they would be disappointed because the two have got very little in common. It's not hard to see how we got to this state. Different types of strategy games grew organically over the 90s and 2000s as they got further and further away from the board and tabletop games that they initially tried to replicate. There is no arbitrary grand council of genre naming, people just gradually found terms they were comfortable with and started using them. Often the labels themselves were the product of game journalists or publishers that needed a catchy phrase to make a product stand out from the crowd. We don't call Command & Conquer an RTS because it just so happens to be that it's a strategy game with a real-time engine. We call it that because Brett Sperry coined the phrase when Westwood were marketing the predecessor to CNC, Dune 2. It's the same with FPS. I'm not sure how the term first-person shooter came about, but it wasn't until years after the release of Doom, with all the games that immediately followed just being called Doom clones. The other problem with strategy as a genre is the continual crossover with tactics. These games often get lumped together as most of them have got elements of both. You could argue that XCOM 2 is a turn-based tactics game because of the fact you're controlling a single squad in small engagements, but you could equally argue that there are elements of both strategy and tactics in each deployment. When you zoom out a little and realise the game involves a whole campaign of resistance that features recruitment, training, research, production and deployment, it's immediately obvious that there's a lot of strategy involved. But if XCOM 2 is a turn-based strategy game, and Hearts of Iron is also a turn-based strategy game, then we have the same problem we had earlier when we were talking about StarCraft and Total War. I've previously been accused of highlighting problems without suggesting solutions, something I never intend to do, but let's have a go at rectifying that. Unfortunately, I'm not a member of the Grand Council of Game Genres, but that doesn't mean that I can't put a little proposal together myself. No one's going to adopt anything I come up with, but the exercise itself might reveal the true difficulties of categorising these things and go some way to explain why the current system is such a mess in the first place. I think we'll have to start with something uncomfortable for some, but let's just rip the band-aid off and get right to it. There is so much crossover between strategy and tactics that we're going to have to use one grand umbrella term to encompass them all. The real-world definitions are confusing enough and heavily depend on the scale we're talking about. In military terms, I like to think of it like this. Strategy is why you go there and who comes with you. Tactics is what you do when you arrive. This, however, is a pretty narrow definition, and in broader terms you can apply the term strategy to an overarching military campaign as well as the politics that made that campaign necessary and all of the individual components that make it possible. Most of the games that I cover on this channel include elements of both, and many of those that consist of tactical missions are often linked together by some sort of grand campaign. So I think the way forward is pretty clear. We'll use the label strategy to describe the vast majority of these games. It's not perfect, but think of it as a shorthand for strategy and tactics, just like rock is a shorthand for rock and roll. So now we've got strategy and tactics, but what about subgenres? Let's grab a big fistful of popular games and see where they fit. Please don't be too offended if I've left out your favourite. There are just so many it would be impossible to list anything other than a tiny fraction. I've not tried to pick out the best games, but simply a cross-section of 20 to 30 that will hopefully be somewhat representative of the genre. Okay, so here's a nice big list of strategy and tactics games for us to play with. But how exactly are we defining strategy again? I think I need to reiterate the point that the word has multiple meanings depending on the exact situation, and in its most abstract sense, strategy is just a fancy word for an overall plan of action. However, there are a couple of things that seem to run through everything that has traditionally been considered a strategy video game. They tend to depict armed conflict, and each player is required to exert direct control over multiple individuals or military units. So, first things first, MOBAs have got to go. I love Dota 2, but it just doesn't meet our strategy criteria. There is one little test I like to do for titles that create confusion. If you change the perspective from top down to first person, would anyone still mistake it for a strategy game? I think in this case the answer is a very clear no. You can't call anything that has an overhead or isometric camera a strategy game, or you would have to include everything from Diablo to SimCity. Let's roughly sort these games by the size of force you get to control and see if we can make a little more sense out of them all. Some of them are a bit harder to place as they include split game modes that feature a large strategic map and smaller individual battles, so they can hang over the middle for the moment. I think a clear pattern is starting to emerge, and we can remove all of the games that already have very clearly defined categories. That's the God games like Populous, the 4Xs like Civ or Stellaris, and the grand strategy games like Hearts of Iron. We can also remove Worms and Mechbellum, as I know they are very unambiguously known as artillery games and auto-battlers respectively. Now they're out of the way, let's focus on turn-based or real-time, but still with a mind for scale, separating out everything that only lets you control a single squad. Total War and Steel Division are still giving us some problems, but the trends with others are pretty clear. The top left gives us real-time tactics, and the top right is turn-based tactics. I think we can also label the bottom right as just turn-based strategy, allowing us to clear a lot of extra stuff off this board. This leaves us with just the larger scale real-time games, and I think I can see a clear split. The games on the left keep their real-time focus on the business of fighting, so I think we can call these real-time combat. On the right are what you would traditionally call real-time strategy. These games have a load of strategic elements like resource acquisition, unit production, research and building, all within the actual real-time battle, while the others do not. Steel Division and Total War are still being tricky, as some of their game modes have those sorts of strategic elements too, but normally as part of a larger strategy campaign rather than the individual real-time battles. I think they're a mix between real-time combat and grand strategy, so calling them something like real-time hybrid is probably more suitable than anything else. As you might have seen, the real difficulty in any simple attempt at categorisation appears to be that there are quite a few games that have a huge amount of crossover when you include all of their various game modes. This is very notable in stuff like Steel Division, where the game experience is highly dependent on what part of it you're playing, whether that be the general campaigns, the individual battles or the multiplayer matches. I guess this is where the multiple categories come in handy and allow us to describe games like Steel Division 2 as both real-time combat and real-time hybrid. So this is the 11 subcategories that I've arrived at. I'm not going to go into too much detail on each definition, but you can always pause the screen and have a look for yourself. For starters, we've got 4X, strategic conquest games like Civ that happen on a huge scale and feature stuff like discovery and diplomacy. There's artillery and auto-battlers to cover titles like Worms and Mechbellum. And moving on, we've got our God games where you get to assume the position of the Almighty, and grand strategy games that are similar to 4X but tend to have their primary focus on waging war. We've also got turn-based strategy, which is a bit of a cop-out, but it covers most things that don't really fit anywhere else. Getting into the real meat are turn-based tactics games. Small squad affairs like XCOM, where you take turns missing 95% shots, and then often have a strategic campaign to manage. Real-time combat covers detailed combat simulations where you bring multiple squads into battle, and real-time tactics covers those small-scale games that often have a stealth focus like Commandos. For dessert, we've got real-time strategy, games like Command & Conquer where everything happens within the real-time engine itself, including all of the building, production and research often found between missions in other games. Finally, we've got real-time hybrids, all of those games that use a turn-based interface to manage strategic moves and production, but use a real-time engine when the swords start crossing or the bullets start flying. Is it a perfect system? Nah, I don't think so. Although I would argue that it's got some improvement on some of the naming and classifications that some people use at the moment. Whenever I upload a video about a certain aspect of RTS, I get a lot of comments from people who assume I'm including War-No or Total War in my complaints or conclusions. It's not their fault. Common parlance and industry labels can be very confusing. Steel Division 2 manages to describe itself as real-time strategy, turn-based army management and real-time tactical, all in a single sentence, hardly a concise synopsis. I searched the Steam store with the RTS tag earlier, and on the first page found Door Kickers, Shiny Ski Resort and Emergency. I'll admit I've only played the first one of those, but I'm pretty sure it's not what I would call a real-time strategy game, and I doubt anyone in the world would describe the other two as such. So, strategy subgenres, a bit of a mess, but not the biggest problem that any one of us has. Still a bit of a shame though, as it makes the discovery of new great games to play just that little bit harder. Anyway, I'll probably adopt the real-time hybrid definition, so if I use that in the future you'll know what I'm talking about. You might think my system is useful or nonsensical crap, but that's cool. Leave a comment and we'll have a little chat about it. And in the meantime, enjoy your strategy games, whatever subgenre they're in. Hi there, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button. And if you've got any questions or feedback, then leave me a comment or join the Discord, which is linked in the description below. And as usual, if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel and I hope to see you back soon.